Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. This is a continuation of the series of over and undervalued players at each position. Top 5 for most of the positions, top 3 for a couple of positions. I will be replaying the same exact introduction at the start of each of these positional videos for the tight ends, specifically for this video. So feel free to skip ahead if you have already seen the other video for this position, because very shortly I'm going to be covering the entire position and how they ranked via their equalized values in the tiers, and then I'll start the countdown of the under/overvalued players, so you can just skip all the way to that countdown if that's all you are here for via the timestamps at the bottom in YouTube. You should know how that works. So this list here is going to be determined with the help of my equalized value system compared to the average fantasy points per week, which is, something that a lot of people look at to determine how players played the previous season, where they ranked, and just call it a day there. But I went one step further a little bit to kind of offset some of the issues with using that system, and I speak all about that in a video, the wide receivers overvalued wide receivers video. I believe it's the overvalued. It's the longer of the two videos in this series for the wide receiver position, where you can see me talk all about the EV system, go into some details of what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are, so check that out. It would be too long to go through in each of these videos, and just a reminder, I go through the first 17 weeks of the fantasy football season, not week 18, because there's just too many issues that come with that week, and players not playing, teams, maybe players playing a half of a game, etc. You can also find this chart, what you're seeing on this screen, up at my website, www.theFFforge.com. There's a link down in the description as well to the website. If this is not up there yet as of the time of you watching this video, congratulations, you're probably one of the earlier viewers of the video, so I definitely appreciate you for that. And it'll be up on the website within a day or two, but I'll have them up after I've posted both the under and overvalued videos for each position. Then I'll put that position up on the website. And what we are looking at here is ordered via the ranking of my equalized value system. Over here on the left, you can see those numbers, but that's the order that they're ranked in. Over here on the right, you can see the average ranking via the average fantasy points per week, which is just to the left of that furthest right column there. And I have those color-coded via the color coding scale here, just like I have my EV system. So tight end 6 here would be in the darkest green, tight end 12 there in a little bit of a lighter green. And then you can see players who either didn't qualify for both being a tight end 12, tight end 18, whatever the case. For the EV system here, if they were scored between 24.75 to 27 points on the EV scale to under 27, so 26.9, then they would have been what we could classify as a tight end 15 here. And so I did color some of those in-betweens, and that's where we have these, and I put a little asterisk by each name. And I think we are at that time. Let's see. Yes, we can go ahead and just look at the position on a whole here. What order do I have them ranked in as far as the value that they brought your teams in the 2022 season? Well, of course, Travis Kelce is the #1 tight end, the only tight end here to be considered a tight end 6 on the season as a whole. Then we have Dallas Goedert also separating himself from the masses here. So you can see that huge gap between Travis Kelce and Dallas Goedert even there. Yeah, once again, #1 tight ends can be absolutely amazing for you, and Travis Kelce was amazing this season. Then we look at the tight end 15s here in a group. We have Zach Ertz, TJ Hawkinson, and George Kittle all doing really, really well for your teams. We follow that up with the tight end 18s, another smaller group here with Mark Andrews, Pat Freiermuth, and Darren Waller. And so I think right there is where I would draw the line as a top 8 tight ends that really actually helped and were reliable tight ends to your team to differing extents. Then we look forward, and Taysom Hill, Dawson Knox, David Njoku, Evan Ingram, Greg Dulcich, Gerald Everett, and Hayden Hurst all fit into a tier. And these players are all going to be your tight end 21s. And I know the coloring's really close here, but I just wanted to differentiate him a little bit, but just a little ways behind those guys, we have the tight end 24s in a tier, and those are going to be your Kyle Pitts, Dalton Schultz, Juwan Johnsons, Cole Kmet, Noah Fant, Tyler Higbee. Players who, from just looking at this list, for the most part, they all had stretches within the season where they were good, or maybe more like a Kyle Pitts is probably just going to be extremely inconsistent with some sort of mediocrity in there. Looks to be about right. Yeah, that was kind of the case. Some of these guys you were able to hop on the train and ride them for a couple of weeks. Other guys you probably whiffed more often than not on at this point. But Tyler Higbee definitely had his periods within the season where you could have capitalized on that, even at the bottom of that list. Then we're going to get on to guys who were truly, hopefully you got lucky with them, fill-ins. And that's going to be Tyler Conklin and Robert Tonyan here. Actually, we have a little tier. And then just below them, we have a tier with Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper. I don't know about you, but those colors look identical to me. I bet you they're not, but yeah. That's why we have the asterisks here to help out. Then we have our final tier as tight end 33s, which is going to be Chigoziem Okonkwo and Mike Gesicki, guys who probably had very, very bottomed out floors with some oomph here and there. And as you can see, in the case of Chig at least, you might have been able to capitalize on it thanks to how that worked out for him throughout the season. But nonetheless, their whole resume, that's what they looked like. So let's move on to the whichever video this is, under or over under ranked. Hard cut. Coming in as my 5th most overvalued tight end from the 2022 season, we have a guy who, according to the fantasy points per week on average, would have been ranked 16th. But according to the EV scale, he is ranked 21st. And that player is Tyler Higbee. Now, before we cover Tyler Higbee, I think I forgot to point this out in my introduction, which means it's not going to be in the underrated tight ends video, but right here you can see what a number 1 tight end on average throughout the past 2 seasons, actually, this is 2 seasons worth of data, would score, which is about 24 points plus or minus 6.5, and that goes so on for each of the benchmarks that I have been tracking. And that is how we determine when these scores, what they qualify as, and how many EV points they get. You know where to find more information on that. But when looking at Tyler Higbee, Tyler started off the season well and almost certainly benefited in part from Cooper Kupp taking the focus off of the defense. On the good side of things, out of 16 games, 7 of Higbee's games were top 12 performances, with one of them being a tight end 1 performance. On the bad side, Higbee had 7 games that were outside of the top 30. 3 of those being wide receiver 45 or worst type performances. And so when we pit him head-to-head up against Gerald Everett, Hayden Hurst, Kyle Pitts, Cole Kmet, and Noah Fant, we would see that he had a head-to-head record of 32 and 32, so split evenly amongst against guys who, according to the average fantasy points per week, he would be better than. And coming in 4th for the most overvalued tight ends, we have a guy who was 2nd according to the average fantasy points per week. However, the EV scale has him pushed back a little ways into position number 5, and that player is George Kittle. Kittle had a very uneven season with 3 tight end 1 performances and 6 tight end 21 to 39 performances. Not the absolute worst floor, nonetheless. He did hit that floor at a fairly high rate. And so when we compared him versus Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz, and TJ Hawkinson, he had a head-to-head record of 13 wins, 14 losses, and 1 tie. Coming in as our 3rd most overrated tight end of the 2022 season, we have a guy who, via the average fantasy points per week, was just outside of the top 12, ranked 13th. However, the EV scale has him ranked 18th, and he is Juwan Johnson. And here's a guy who I definitely fell for his production, just as far as how highly I started to suggest him as a starter throughout the season in my sit-start rankings on a weekly basis. And so I fell for the numbers at a certain point, but luckily his output was quite linear. He wasn't super inconsistent. It kind of all came in a bunch, and he did have a weak start to the season, and then he went on a roll for the second half of it. Unfortunately, if you look at that stretch starting here in week 7, you do see he did randomly drop 3 stinkers, but we are talking about the tight end position, and so out of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games there, 3 stinkers is not so bad. That's really good, and that's why he, via the average fantasy points per week, and even on the EV scale, is close to a top 15 guy, really, if we want to take the average of them. So it's not like Juwan had a terrible season, and like I said, it did come somewhat linearly, so that was good. But when we compare him versus Dawson Knox, Greg Dulcich, Gerald Everett, Hayden Hurst, and Kyle Pitts, we would see that he had a head-to-head record of 28-26. Not so bad. He held up quite well to the testing here, but I do have to say that upon a closer look, Juwan took full advantage of his good games, and he got a couple of victories on some pretty bad games, but that is all also a part of the analysis for better or worse. And ultimately, what really helped him was his head-to-head matchup against Kyle Pitts, who he went 7-3 against. He cleaned up against Pitts, who is by far the worst of this bunch. As you can see, just one spot ahead of him via both the EV scale and the average fantasy points per week. He's the worst of the bunch, so that's the only guy who was on the same tier as him, beat him up a little bit. It took full advantage of his good games and really got the most out of him in terms of victories. Didn't lose to this number 1 performance here for Dawson Knox in week 15, got a victory again against that. So, things just kind of worked in his favor, but let's keep chugging along here on to the second most overvalued tight end of the 2022 season, a player who, via the average fantasy points per week, was all the way in the top 10, ranked number 8. However, the equalized value had him pushed back into just the top 12 at the 12th spot, and that player is Evan Ingram. And I was thumping the Evan Ingram drum before anyone I know of during this season, and I had varying success in terms of weeks that I was suggesting him or fading him, but for the most part, I felt pretty good about how much I liked him. That said, the 8th best tight end on the season does seem a little bit rich to me, so I'm in agreement with the EV definitely here. He had 6 tight end 27 or worse games. That's 0.9 to 3.4 points. Pretty yucky games overall there. And when we compared him going up against Pat Freiermuth, Darren Waller, Dawson Knox, and David Njoku, Evan Ingram has a head-to-head record of 20 wins and 27 losses. So that's what earned him the second spot here. He definitely did not do good up against the somewhat equalized competition that he's supposed to be doing well against. He earned his spot. I almost forgot about it. We do have a couple of honorable mentions, and there are 2 of them. They're going to be Mark Andrews and Taysom Hill. Mark Andrews, one that I have had experience with this season, and I can definitely say it would be easy to overvalue him going into next season, but it would also be easy to undervalue him based on this last season. It was a very uneven season. He was definitely hurtful, and so I would be in agreement closer with what the EV scale has them as the overall pecking order for their performance last season. But going forward, I personally am, I still think he's probably at least the best tight end outside of Travis Kelce in the league, especially in that system is a part of it for fantasy reasons. And as far as Taysom Hill goes, obviously he wouldn't perform too well on the EV scale. So let's move on to the number 1 player on this list. The most overvalued tight end of the 2022 season. He was ranked 11th via the average fantasy points per week. But via the EV scale, he was all the way back at the 17th spot. And that player's name is Dalton Schultz. A quick review of his output shows a very inconsistent season with a very low floor. A couple of goose eggs and a 0.8 fantasy point output, really highlighting the downside to Dalton Schultz's 2022 season. Here's those goose eggs, that output here. That was an injury game. Well, don't forget about that. Versus players like Dawson Knox, David Njoku, Greg Dulcich, Gerald Everett, Hayden Hurst, and Kyle Pitts, as we can see up on the screen. We would find out that he had a head-to-head record of 25 wins and 33 losses, by far the biggest, at least I think ratio-wise, but the most losses against his competition here. And looking forward, if we were to remove the span where he was clearly injured, he would have gone 25 and 20, and that definitely looks much better on the whole. So going into next season, not going to hold this positioning up against him too much. This was more of a 2022 thing in my eyes. If there is one player I'm going to be the most concerned about on this list, it would be the second spot there for 2023, and that's Evan Ingram, especially if he lands back on the Jaguars. We'll see what happens with that. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in to this video. I appreciate it, and I hope you check out the other ones and enjoy these. So thank you. Peace out.